There is a kind of love that does not announce itself loudly. It does not arrive with fanfare or certainty. It comes quietly, like rain on a bus station roof, steady, gray, and impossible to ignore once you have heard it. And sometimes, love makes a promise in the middle of that rain, a promise so simple and so enormous that it takes more than a decade to understand whether it was kept. This is one of those stories. It begins with a boy who had nothing but his hands and his heart, and a girl who had everything ahead of her and the courage to chase it. It begins with a goodbye that was supposed to be temporary, and it ends, though ending is perhaps the wrong word, with two people standing across from each other, older and changed, holding the weight of all those missing years, and choosing, still, to close the distance between them. 12 years before the story finds its resolution, Daniel Mercer was 25 years old and possessed of very little that the world considered valuable. He rented a room in a house that listed faintly to the left, as though tired of standing. He worked the morning shift at a machine shop on the edge of town, a job that left his palms rough and his shoulders aching by noon. He ate sandwiches from a paper bag and counted his change before ordering anything. He was not unhappy. Exactly. He had learned early that happiness was something you constructed from the materials available, and he had always been good with his hands. But he was aware, in the way that young men sometimes are, of the vast distance between where he stood and where he wanted to be. He could not have told you precisely where that was. He knew only that it was somewhere that smelled less like machine oil and more like something he had not yet imagined. He was, in the plainest terms, a man at the beginning of a story he could not yet read. Then he met Emma. Emma Caldwell was 20 years old when she walked into the coffee shop where she worked part-time, an MBA textbook under one arm and a pencil tucked behind her ear. She had grown up in a family that was not poor but was never quite comfortable. A family where ambition was discussed the way some families discuss religion, as both a duty and a salvation. She was sharp and fast-thinking, and she had the particular quality of certain people who have decided, at a very young age, that the world is not going to hand them anything, and who have made their peace with that decision. She was also, though she would not have described herself this way, profoundly kind. She noticed things. She remembered the names of regular customers. She brought extra napkins before people asked. She was the sort of person who made you feel, simply by paying attention to you, that you were worth paying attention to. Daniel noticed this before he noticed anything else about her. He came in for coffee one morning because the shop was warm and he had 20 minutes before his shift. And she set his cup down and said, without looking up from the counter she was wiping, that the rain was supposed to let up by noon. It did not. But he came back the next morning, and the morning after that. What grew between them in the months that followed was not dramatic in the way that love stories are sometimes required to be dramatic. It was quiet and accumulative. It was walks home after her evening shift ended, the two of them moving through streets that smelled of wet pavement and fallen leaves, talking about everything and nothing. It was splitting a plate of pasta at the Italian place that gave generous portions for $7, and deciding together that it was the best meal either of them had ever had. It was sitting on the front steps of his tilting house on warm nights, while she read to him from her textbooks, and he listened not because he understood macroeconomics, but because her voice did something to the air around them that he could not explain. It was the gradual, undeniable accumulation of shared mornings and evenings, of small jokes and small kindnesses, until the shape of one person's daily life became inseparable from the presence of the other. They were young, and they did not have much, and they were, without quite knowing it, deeply and seriously in love. Then Emma received the scholarship letter. It came on a Tuesday in late autumn, a full graduate fellowship at a university in the city, 400 miles north, the kind of opportunity that arrives once and does not apologize for the inconvenience of its timing. She stared at the letter for a long time before she called Daniel. When she finally did, her voice was careful and controlled, the way voices are when the person speaking is deciding how much to let through. She told him it was an incredible opportunity. She told him she had worked for this for years. She told him she didn't know what to do. Daniel told her there was nothing to decide. He said it simply and without hesitation, though it cost him something to say it. And she heard that cost in the slight pause before his words arrived. He said she had to go. He said this was everything she had worked for. And Emma, who was not a person given to easy crying, pressed her hand flat against the kitchen counter to steady herself and said that she knew. They did not speak again about what this meant for them. They did not need to. Both of them understood, in the way that people understand things they would prefer not to, that the world was pulling them in two directions at once, and that the pull was stronger than either of them. The morning of her departure arrived in the way that dreaded mornings always do abruptly, despite all the time spent anticipating them. Emma's bags were packed, and sitting by the door, her roommate had already moved out. The apartment was stripped to its bare walls, and the emptiness of it made everything feel more final than either of them had wanted it to feel. Daniel carried her largest bag to the bus station because she would not let him pay for a cab, and he would not hear of her managing it alone. They walked the 6 blocks without talking much, shoulders occasionally touching, the city moving around them with its usual complete indifference to the gravity of what they were carrying. The bus station was small and smelled of burnt coffee and vinyl seats. There were other people saying other goodbyes around them, but Daniel did not see any of them. He saw only Emma, standing with her ticket in her hand, her hair pulled back, her eyes very bright, and her jaw set in that particular way it set when she was trying to be strong about something. She wanted him to come with her. She did not say it directly, because she knew what he would say, and because she understood she had always understood that there were things holding him here that she could not argue away. His mother, Margaret, had been sick for 2 years by then. A slow and uncertain illness that required constant attention, and that Daniel provided without complaint and without being asked. He could not leave. He would not leave. Emma knew this as surely as she knew her own name, and she had loved him for it, even as it broke something in her. They stood together on the platform, the bus idling 20 feet away, and Daniel held both of her hands in his. He was aware of every detail of that moment with a peculiar, painful clarity. The cold of the morning, the weight of her hands, the sound of the bus engine, the way she was looking at him. He said the words simply, without preparation or preamble, because they were true and because the moment required them. He said, "One day, I'll come back and marry you." He meant it as a promise. He meant it as an anchor dropped into the future, something to hold the two of them in relation to each other across whatever distance was coming. Emma looked at him for a long moment. Then she pressed her lips together, and her eyes filled, and she said, "I'll wait." The bus door opened. She picked up her bag. She turned back once, from the top of the steps, and looked at him. Then she was gone. Daniel stood on the platform until the bus had pulled away, and the exhaust had cleared, and there was nothing left to look at. He stood there a little longer after that, then he turned and walked back through the city alone. Neither of them knew, standing on that platform, that 12 years would pass before they saw each other again. They thought it would be months, perhaps a year. They thought the distance was temporary, a gap to be closed as soon as circumstances allowed, as soon as his mother's health stabilized, as soon as he had saved enough money to make the trip, as soon as things became simpler. Things did not become simpler. Life, as it tends to do, had its own architecture, and it bore very little resemblance to the structure they had imagined for themselves. In the years that followed Emma's departure, Daniel's world contracted and changed in ways he had not foreseen. His mother's illness worsened through the first winter, steadied briefly in the spring, then declined again with a kind of slow, grinding inevitability that left him exhausted in a way that sleep could not fix. He called Emma when he could. The calls became less frequent as his days grew longer and his mother's needs grew greater. The calls became emails. The emails became shorter. And then, in the 3rd year after the bus platform, his mother passed away in a hospital room on a gray February morning, while Daniel held her hand, and something in the architecture of his life shifted in a way that could not be shifted back. In the aftermath of grief, people sometimes make choices they would not otherwise make, not out of carelessness, but out of a desperate need for something solid to hold on to. Daniel met a woman named Sandra, 6 months after his mother's death. She was warm and uncomplicated, and present in a way that the weight of the previous years had made him crave almost without his realizing it. They married quickly, impulsively, with more hope than certainty, and for a brief period the marriage provided exactly what he had needed it to provide. But hope and certainty are not the same thing. And what had felt like connection in the early months revealed itself, slowly and painfully, to be two people who were not wrong for the world, but were wrong for each other. When their son, Noah, was born small and loud, and astonishingly himself from the first moment Daniel held him in the delivery room and felt, simultaneously, the most complete love he had ever experienced, and the sharp, quiet knowledge that the marriage around it was not going to hold. Sandra left when Noah was 11 months old. She left without cruelty and without apology, which was, in its way, worse than either would have been. She left a note that said she was sorry, and that she hoped Daniel would understand someday. He did, eventually, but that was later. In the immediate aftermath, he was a 29-year-old man sitting in a small apartment with an almost 1-year-old and a note on the kitchen table. And the weight of what had just become his life was considerable. The years that followed were defined by a specific kind of exhaustion that only single parents know, the bone-deep, perpetual tiredness of being the only one. Of there being no handoff, no relief, no moment when someone else takes the weight. Daniel changed diapers alone in the middle of the night. He heated formula in the dark, half asleep, bumping into door frames. He worked 2 jobs, the machine shop during the day, and a handyman service on evenings and weekends, and arranged his schedule around Noah's daycare hours with the obsessive precision of a man who understood that any gap in the system was a gap he would have to fill himself. He became expert in the arithmetic of a life lived without margin, which bills could wait 3 days, which could not, which groceries to buy when the account was low, which meals Noah would eat without complaint. He became expert, too, in the quieter disciplines of solo parenthood. How to make a Saturday afternoon feel like an adventure on a budget that would not accommodate adventures, how to explain absence without assigning blame, how to answer a 4-year-old's question about where mommy was, in a way that was honest and gentle simultaneously. Noah was a boy of extraordinary resilience, which Daniel credited to Noah's own nature, and which Noah, when he was old enough to have an opinion on the subject, would credit to his father. They built a life that was narrow in certain measurable ways, and wide in the ways that mattered most. Daniel read to Noah every night. He attended every school performance, sometimes still in his work clothes because there had not been time to change. He cooked real dinners when he could, and did not apologize for cereal when he could not. He was tired in a way that became his baseline, a tiredness so familiar he stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing the sound of traffic after years of living near a highway. And through all of it, the sleepless nights, and the double shifts, and the arithmetic of stretching money that was never quite enough, he thought about Emma. He thought about the bus platform. He thought about the promise he had made. And each time he thought about it, he looked at the reality of his life, the narrow apartment, the unpaid bills, the second-hand furniture, the perpetual exhaustion, and he felt the promise recede, not because he had abandoned it, but because he could not imagine arriving at Emma Caldwell's door in this condition and asking her to want him. 400 miles north, Emma Caldwell was building something. It was not a simple or comfortable process. The years of her graduate program and early career were a sustained exercise in being underestimated by professors who addressed her male classmates during her own presentations, by investors who asked her to bring coffee to meetings she was running, by competitors who assumed that her youth and gender were liabilities she had not yet figured out how to compensate for. She figured them out. She worked 16-hour days, not out of compulsion but out of strategy, understanding that the only reliable counter to being underestimated was to make the gap between expectation and reality so wide that it became impossible to ignore. She founded her company, Meridian Technologies, in a rented office space that had previously been a dry cleaning shop, with 2 employees and a business plan she had revised 47 times. Within 3 years, Meridian had a staff of 80 and a client list that included 3 Fortune 500 companies. Within 6, she was on the cover of a business magazine under the headline, "The CEO Who Builds Things That Last." She was 31 years old. Successful beyond any measure she had imagined on those walks home from the coffee shop. And she was, by any reasonable external assessment, living a life most people would have considered complete. But completion is a funny thing. Emma had an office with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over a skyline she had spent a decade working to inhabit, and she sat in that office sometimes in the early evening, after her assistant had gone home and the building had gone quiet, and she was aware of something that success had not addressed. The feeling was not loneliness. Exactly, she was too busy for the sustained experience of loneliness, and she had built a life too full of purpose to mistake its occasional silences for emptiness. It was something more precise than that. It was the awareness that she had been measuring the progress of her life against a version of the future that included another person, and that other person had not arrived. She had not stopped expecting him. This was perhaps the most honest and most inexplicable thing about her, that through 15-hour days and product launches and board meetings and all the apparatus of building an empire, she had continued, at some level beneath the practical and the rational, to expect him. She kept, in the middle drawer of her desk, a photograph and a small folded card. The photograph was of her and Daniel, taken by a stranger on a summer afternoon. Leaning against a fence post, somewhere outside town, both of them laughing at something that had already been forgotten. The card was a birthday note he had written her in the second year of their relationship, 3 lines in his slightly uneven handwriting. Nothing remarkable, nothing she could explain the significance of to anyone who had not been there. She had carried both of them through 4 apartments and 2 office moves, and a decade of becoming someone entirely different from the girl in the photograph. Her closest friend and COO, Rachel, asked her once not unkindly why she had never been in a serious relationship. They were at dinner after a long day, and Rachel had had 2 glasses of wine, and the kind of directness that comes with genuine affection and mild exasperation. Emma considered the question carefully. She thought about the several men who had, over the years, offered her something, real men, who were intelligent and decent, and who had looked at her with the particular quality of attention that means the attention is about you specifically, not about what you represent or what you have achieved. She had not been unkind to any of them. She had been, she suspected, simply unavailable in a way that no amount of scheduling could fix. Unavailable at the level where availability actually matters. Then she reached into her jacket pocket and set the photograph on the table between them. Rachel looked at it for a long time. Emma said, "Because I made a promise too." Rachel did not ask any more questions that evening. She understood that some things are not irrational simply because they are difficult to explain. The reunion, when it came, arrived in the form of a 6th-grade science competition. Noah had always been a serious, curious child, the kind of boy who disassembled things not to break them but to understand them, and who asked questions with such genuine intensity that his teachers sometimes forgot they were supposed to be answering a child. He entered his school's regional science fair with a project on water filtration systems, a topic he had chosen after Daniel spent an evening explaining how the filtration unit in their building worked while fixing a clogged pipe. Noah's project was good, precise, and clearly explained, and built with his own hands, and it advanced to a citywide competition sponsored, in part, by a consortium of technology companies. One of the primary sponsors was Meridian Technologies. Daniel drove Noah to the event on a Saturday morning without looking too carefully at the list of sponsors on the registration form. He was wearing clean clothes and carrying Noah's presentation boards and thinking mostly about whether he had remembered to bring the spare batteries for the demonstration model. He had not thought about who might be there. Emma arrived at the venue as the keynote speaker. She had agreed to this engagement 3 months earlier as part of Meridian's education outreach initiative, and she had prepared a short address about the importance of scientific curiosity and the particular value of building things with your own hands. She was backstage, reviewing her notes, when the event coordinator told her it was time. She walked out onto the stage and looked out at the assembled audience, parents, teachers, children with their projects arrayed on folding tables along the gymnasium walls, and began to speak. She was 4 minutes into her remarks when she saw him. He was standing near the back, slightly to her left, holding a program booklet he had folded in half. Without appearing to notice, he had done it. He was older, of course he was older. They both were, but the particular quality of how he stood, with that mix of attentiveness and self-containment she had always recognized, was unchanged. Emma's voice continued producing sentences, while the rest of her mind went completely still. She finished her speech. She received applause she did not hear. She shook hands with the event director, and then, from across the gymnasium, she watched Daniel Mercer place his hand on the shoulder of a boy who was clearly his son and say something that made the boy smile. The sight of it, the ease of it, the simple, ordinary tenderness of it did something complicated to the region around her ribs that she was not prepared for. After the competition, as parents and children filtered out into the lobby, Emma made her way through the crowd with a purposefulness that her assistant would have recognized immediately as the same quality she brought to every situation she considered important. She found him near the coat rack, helping Noah put on his jacket. She stopped about 3 feet away. She said his name. Just his name. Nothing else. And Daniel turned around. The expression on his face in the moment before he could compose it was something she filed away carefully. Surprise, recognition, and something else she could not immediately name. Something older and more complicated than surprise. He said her name back. Then neither of them said anything at all for several seconds. And the lobby moved around them with its noise and its coats and its children. And none of it was remotely relevant. They had coffee the following Thursday, at a place Emma chose because it was quiet and unhurried. They sat across from each other for a moment before either of them spoke. Both of them apparently finding it necessary to do a kind of silent accounting of all that time. All those changes, all the distance between the people they had been and the people they were sitting there. Then they began to talk. And the talking, once started, did not easily stop. Emma told him about Meridian, about the early years, about the particular texture of building something from nothing, which was, she said, smiling, something she suspected he understood. Daniel told her about Noah, about the science fair project, about the 11 years of figuring out how to be a father when no one had prepared him for the version of fatherhood he had received. He did not tell her, not yet, about Sandra. He did not tell her about the debt, the 2 jobs, the years of counting change in the parking lot of the grocery store to see if he could afford the good coffee. He told her the broad shapes of things and kept the edges to himself, not from dishonesty but from a kind of self-protection that had become so habitual he barely recognized it as such. And as he listened to Emma, to the confidence in her voice, to the quiet sureness of someone who has built a life she is genuinely proud of, he felt the old feeling return, the one he had been outrunning for years. Not inadequacy, exactly. Something more specific and more painful than that. The feeling of standing at the edge of something wonderful and believing, with a quiet and terrible certainty, that you do not belong inside it. Emma invited him to coffee a second time, and a third. They fell into a careful, tentative rhythm conversations over lunch. Once a walk through the park near his apartment on a Sunday afternoon, with Noah running ahead of them along the path. It was on one of those afternoons, sitting on a bench while Noah investigated something at the base of a tree, that Daniel said what had been sitting in him since the gymnasium. He said it simply, without preamble, the way he said things that cost him something. He said that she deserved someone better. He said it carefully, not as a performance of humility, but as a statement of what he genuinely believed, and the belief was visible in every word. He said he was a single father with debt, and a job that left his hands rough, and a life that had not gone according to any plan he had ever made for himself. He said she was extraordinary, that she had always been extraordinary, and that the distance between where they were standing was not something he could pretend did not exist. He said all of this to the path in front of them rather than to her face. When he finished, Emma was quiet long enough that he looked up. Her eyes were full. She was not crying, not quite, but the fullness was there and it was real. She said, "The person I want has always been you." She said it without drama and without decoration, the way you say something you have known for a long time and have been waiting for the right moment to put into words. Daniel looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Noah, who had turned from his tree to wave at them from 20 feet away, and he had the feeling, precise and overwhelming, of a man who has been given something he does not quite know how to hold. What followed was not simple. The news of their renewed relationship moved quickly through Emma's world, which was larger and more scrutinized than either of them had been prepared for. Her parents, Gerald and Patricia Caldwell, were people of considerable achievement who had watched their daughter build her empire with a mixture of pride and the particular parental anxiety that comes from loving someone who takes large risks. Gerald Caldwell called Emma the week after news of Daniel reached him, and the conversation was direct in the way that Gerald's conversations had always been direct. He said that he admired a man who worked hard and raised his child well, but that he was concerned about the circumstances. He said with the measured precision of a man who had spent his career in finance that the differential between their situations was significant, and that significant differentials had a way of creating problems that goodwill alone could not solve. He said he did not want to see Emma taken advantage of, even by someone she cared for. Emma listened to all of this without interrupting. Then she said that she appreciated his concern, and that she was going to continue doing what she was doing. Gerald called Daniel directly several days later. The conversation was brief. Gerald said that he respected Daniel as a father, but that as a potential partner for his daughter, he needed to see more than effort and good intentions. He said, "A man like you cannot walk into a family like ours." Daniel thanked him for his time and hung up the phone and sat with the words for a long while, feeling them settle into old grooves that had been waiting for them. The pressure was not only from Emma's side. The neighborhood where Daniel had lived for years had its own particular geography of opinion, and the opinion was not uniformly warm. His co-workers at the shop made jokes that were not entirely jokes about luck and timing, and what exactly a woman like Emma Caldwell would see in a man who spent his days under a car. His neighbor, a retired man named Warren, who sat on his porch each evening and held views on most subjects, told Daniel that he was setting himself up for embarrassment. Even some of Daniel's friends, men who had known him for years and meant him well, conveyed in subtle and not-so-subtle ways a kind of uneasy skepticism, as though Daniel were attempting something that the rules of the world did not quite permit. Noah, who was 12 years old and possessed of a child's direct and uncluttered moral reasoning, listened to his father describe some of these conversations one evening and said, with complete seriousness, "Dad, those people are wrong." Daniel looked at his son and felt, not for the first time, that the boy had inherited something from somewhere that had skipped a generation. Gerald Caldwell's directness, which had served him well in 30 years of business, served him badly in the weeks that followed, because it led him to do something that he intended as due diligence, and that turned out to be something else entirely. He hired a private research firm to look into Daniel Mercer. He expected to find debt and unremarkability. He found those things. He also found a record of 11 years of quiet conduct that was, in its way, more revealing than any financial document. He found a boy named Marcus, the child of Daniel's downstairs neighbor, whose mother had been ill for a year while Daniel drove Marcus to school each morning without being asked and without mentioning it to anyone. He found a GoFundMe campaign that Daniel had contributed to anonymously the maximum allowable anonymous amount for a co-worker's daughter's medical bills. He found 2 different elderly neighbors who, in interviews conducted with the care of people who did not often have occasion to say such things out loud, described Daniel as the closest thing they had to family in this city. Gerald sat with this information for 3 days before he showed it to Patricia. Patricia read it twice. Then she set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long time and said, "Gerald, I think we have been asking the wrong questions." Gerald, who was a fair man when fairness was presented to him clearly enough, agreed. The family dinner that Emma had been dreading took place on a Sunday in November. The table was set. The conversation was careful and deliberate, in the way of conversations where everyone present understands that more is at stake than the words actually being spoken. Halfway through the evening, something shifted. It shifted when Noah, who had come with Daniel at Emma's insistence, and who had been quiet for most of the meal, asked Gerald what kind of engineering work he had done before finance. Gerald, surprised, answered. Noah asked a follow-up question. Gerald answered that too. The conversation between a 64-year-old man and a 12-year-old about structural load distribution was the most genuine exchange that had occurred at that table all evening, and something about it loosened the air in the room. Later, near the end of the night, when the table had been cleared and Daniel and Gerald were briefly alone in the kitchen, Gerald said, without preamble, "My daughter has been waiting for you for a long time." Daniel said, "I know." Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Don't make her wait anymore." It was not an apology. Exactly. It was something quieter and more durable than an apology. Daniel held out his hand, and Gerald shook it. But Gerald's changed heart alone was not the whole of what Daniel needed. What Daniel needed, and had needed for a long time without fully articulating it to himself, was to arrive at Emma not as someone who had been accepted despite his limitations, but as someone who had earned his own standing. This distinction mattered to him in a way that was difficult to explain to people who had not grown up the way he had, in a world where your worth was visible in the work you could or could not produce. He had enrolled in an engineering certification program 6 months earlier, during the period when he and Emma were first finding their way back to each other, driven not by any particular plan but by a sense that the skills he had accumulated over a decade needed a formal structure to give them full weight. He worked on the coursework at night, after Noah was asleep, with the same methodical patience he brought to everything. Noah noticed, the way perceptive children notice things adults assume they will not, the open textbooks on the kitchen table, when he came down for water at 10 o'clock, the yellow highlighter marks, the small stack of completed workbooks growing on the shelf by the window. Noah did not comment on it directly for several weeks. Then one evening he sat down across from his father, while Daniel was working through a hydraulics module, and said, with perfect seriousness, that he was going to be an engineer too. Daniel looked up. He said he thought that sounded like an excellent plan. Noah said, "We can work together someday." Daniel held his son's gaze for a moment, feeling the full weight of all the years that had produced this particular child in this particular kitchen, making this particular offer, and said, "I would like that very much." He expanded the repair service he had been running informally into a registered business, Mercer Technical Services, and he spent weekends building a client base with the kind of steady, reliable work that generates recommendations without requiring advertising. The business grew slowly, and then more quickly than he had expected. And the sensation of watching it grow was unlike anything else he had experienced, not because of the money, though the money mattered, but because of what it told him about himself. It told him that the years of working with his hands had not been a detour from his real life. They had been the preparation for it. Every machine he had repaired, every system he had diagnosed in the dark with nothing but his experience to guide him, had been building towards something he had not yet had a name for. He had a name for it now. He was building toward the version of himself that could look Emma in the eye and say, "I have not been waiting for you to rescue me. I have been doing the work." The moment that crystallized his standing in the eyes of the people who had doubted him came in March, roughly 2 years after the gymnasium. One of Meridian's manufacturing partners, a firm that handled the physical production components of Meridian's infrastructure projects called Emma in crisis, a newly installed automated assembly system, had developed a failure pattern that 3 separate engineers had been unable to diagnose. Production was stopped. The financial exposure was significant. Emma, who had by now stopped maintaining any useful fiction about the separation between her professional and personal life, mentioned the problem to Daniel over dinner. He asked several questions. He asked them methodically, in the order that made technical sense, and Emma answered each one, and noticed how the order of them traced a diagnostic logic she recognized from watching him work. He asked to see the system schematics. He identified the failure point in 40 minutes. It was a calibration issue, the kind of thing that a man who had spent 12 years troubleshooting mechanical systems with his hands rather than a tablet recognized immediately, the kind of thing that was invisible to engineers who had learned their trade from drawings rather than from machines. The fix took 4 hours to implement. When it was done, the plant manager, a careful and unsentimental man named Gordon, called Emma and said, "Where has this man been hiding?" Emma said, "I've been asking myself that for 12 years. There was a board meeting the following month at which Daniel's contribution to the Meridian partner crisis was referenced, not extensively, but specifically, and several board members who had heard Emma mention his name in passing over the preceding months now attached a different kind of attention to it. Gerald, who sat on the board in an advisory capacity, said nothing during this portion of the meeting. He did not need to. The silence he maintained was a different kind of silence than the one he had maintained at their first dinner. It was the silence of a man who has revised his position and is satisfied with the revision. The proposal happened on a Thursday morning in April. It was not a grand gesture. Daniel had considered grand gestures and had concluded that they were not the right language for what he needed to say, that what he needed to say was too serious for spectacle. He picked up Emma from her office at the end of her workday, something he had started doing on Thursdays over the preceding months, and they walked, as they used to walk, through streets that had turned cool and clear with the evening air. He had bought it with money from Mercer Technical Services' first good quarter, not an extravagant ring, not a ring designed to signal wealth, but a ring chosen with the care of a man who had spent a long time thinking about what he wanted to say with the object itself. They stopped at a small park that neither of them had been to before, near a fountain that was running despite the lateness of the season. And Daniel turned to face her. He did not get down on one knee, because the path was wet, and Emma would have told him not to anyway. He held the ring between them and said, "I told you I would come back." Emma's breath left her in a sound that was not quite a word. He said, "I'm back." She said, "I know." He said, "Marry me." She said yes before he had finished the sentence. The wedding was held in June, at a venue that Emma chose for its garden, and Daniel approved for its lack of excess. The ceremony was small, 50 people, family, and the friends who had earned the designation. The officiant was a judge who had known Emma's family for years. The garden was strung with simple lights that were unnecessary in the afternoon sun, but that would matter later, when the evening came in soft and warm and everyone was still there, unwilling to leave. Daniel's co-workers from the shop were present, uncomfortable and pleased in equal measure, standing slightly apart from Emma's business associates, with the awareness of men who know they are in a different world, but who have decided, for this particular afternoon, that the difference does not need to resolve itself. Rachel sat in the front row with a composure that lasted until Noah stepped forward, at which point it did not. Gerald Caldwell sat beside his wife and wore the expression of a man who has been wrong about something important and is managing his satisfaction at having been corrected. Noah stood beside his father in a dark suit that required 3 separate fittings because he grew an inch between the first and the final one. He had been given a specific role, the one that had been discussed in advance, and that he had accepted with a gravity that made Daniel think, not for the first time, that Noah was going to be fine in this world, better than fine. At the moment in the ceremony when the officiant called for the rings, Noah stepped forward from his place at Daniel's side and placed the rings on the small pillow he had been holding, with such concentrated care that his knuckles were white. He looked up at his father, and then at Emma, and he said in a voice that was quiet but entirely clear in the stillness of the garden, "Dad kept his promise." There was a sound from the assembled guests that was not quite laughter and not quite crying, but occupied the space between them with complete precision. Emma pressed her free hand against her mouth. She was thinking, in that moment, of a bus platform 12 years ago, and a boy holding her hands in the cold and saying words that had seemed, in the years of their silence, like something she might have imagined. She was thinking of the photograph in her desk drawer. She was thinking of Rachel asking her why she had never married, and of setting that photograph on the table. She was thinking of all the versions of this moment she had carried through the years, without knowing whether she was carrying something real or something she had made up to comfort herself. Daniel was watching her face. He was thinking of the platform too, of the bus pulling away, of the exhaust clearing, of the emptiness of the space where she had stood. He was thinking of Noah asleep in his room on 100 late nights, while he sat at the kitchen table with certification, textbooks, and a cup of cold coffee, and the quiet, persistent belief that the story was not over. The officiant asked Daniel if he took Emma Caldwell to be his wife, and Daniel said "I do" with the voice of a man who has been waiting to say exactly those words in exactly this context for more than a decade. He held her hands in his, and the hands were different now, her hands more certain, his more worn, but the holding was the same as it had always been. He said, "I came back." Emma looked at him through the particular brightness of a woman who has been practicing patience long enough to understand that it is not the same thing as passivity, that it is, in fact, its own kind of strength. She said, "And I was waiting." What came after was not an ending but a continuation. Noah acquired a stepmother who treated his curiosity as the gift it was, and who appeared, to his considerable interest, to already know most of the answers to his most complicated questions. He took to calling her Emma when they were being formal, and M when they were not, a distinction he maintained with the unconscious social precision of a child who has learned early that language carries weight. Daniel's business grew steadily through that first year of marriage and the years that followed, built on the reputation of a man who did what he said and said only what he could do. He hired his first employee 18 months after the wedding, a young man named Tyler who had been working at the machine shop and whom Daniel recognized immediately as someone with the same quality of attention he himself had always brought to mechanical problems. He hired a second employee 3 months later. He did not rush the growth. He built it the way he built everything, one careful, solid piece at a time. Emma continued to run Meridian, expanding its education and infrastructure work into areas she had been planning for years, executing with the patient ferocity that had always been her signature. They bought a house, not a large house, and not in the neighborhood where such purchases were expected of someone in Emma's position. A house with a back garden and a kitchen that faced east, and a room for Noah that he designed himself, down to the position of the bookshelves. In the second year of their marriage, they established the Meridian Mercer Foundation, a scholarship program for single parents, pursuing vocational and technical education, funded jointly by Emma's company and Daniel's business, administered by a board that included Rachel, Gerald, and a woman named Carol, who ran the daycare center where Noah had spent his early mornings while Daniel worked the first shift at the machine shop. The foundation's first cohort was 12 people. By the third year, it was 40. Daniel attended each cohort's orientation and spoke for 20 minutes about what it had taken him and what it had given him, and how the two things were not as different as they might appear. He was not a polished speaker. He was something better than polished. He was precise and honest and present in a way that left people in those rooms feeling seen rather than addressed, and several of the scholarship recipients told him afterward that what he had said was the most useful thing anyone had said to them in years. And sometimes, on evenings when the work was done, and Noah was at a friend's house, and the city was doing what cities do in the late light of a June evening, Emma and Daniel would drive out to the part of town where the coffee shop had been. It was a different business now, a florist. Though the same narrow windows remained, and they would park and sit in the car for a little while, and not say very much. The bus station was 3 blocks further down, unchanged. Neither of them went to look at it. They did not need to. They had each carried the memory of it for so long that it had become something other than a memory, something closer to a room they both knew how to navigate in the dark, a place they could return to without physically returning, and find waiting for them, exactly as they had left it. The two young people they had been on a cold morning a long time ago, making promises neither of them had any way of knowing they would be able to keep. True love is not a story about perfect timing. It is not a story about two people who found each other easily and held on without difficulty and arrived at happiness without the cost of years. True love, in its most honest form, is the story of two people who made a choice over and over, in the absence of certainty, in the presence of everything that argued against it, to believe that the other person was still there. It is the story of a promise made in the rain, and honored not with a single heroic act, but with the accumulated weight of 1,000 ordinary ones. Every night Daniel read to his son. Every morning Emma opened the desk drawer and did not remove the photograph. Every quiet decision each of them made to keep going in the direction of something they could not yet see clearly, but refused to stop believing in. It is the story of a man who kept working, and a woman who kept waiting, and a boy who told them both, with perfect simplicity, the only thing that needed to be said. It is the story of what survives, when what survives is everything that matters.